My name is Tom Countryman. I've had the honor for the last 6 months of being the chairman of the board of directors of the Arms Control Association. That's an honor, but it's an even bigger honor to introduce to you 3 outstanding colleagues from whom I've learned a great deal, who have devoted their careers to building national and global security, to fighting against the spread of weapons of mass destruction, to reducing the risks of possession and use of such weapons. And they're going to speak today in accordance with our theme, the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, about what we can expect in the coming 2 years, what are the current measures that can be considered to build on and to strengthen the NPT in its implementation. So I introduced them very briefly. They're all very worthy of your attention. We'll start first with Ambassador Lewis Dunn, who led the U.S. delegation at the crucial 1995 NPT Review Conference. 85, excuse me.
You're older than you think.
He's
Twice as crucial.
Just a kid then, but okay. Thank you, 1985. Second, we'll hear from Ambassador Dell Higgie, who you already heard a little bit from this morning. And third, Andrea, who's currently serving at the National Security Council as the Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation issues. So I think we'll launch right into it. And Lou, take it away.
Thank you, Tom. I shall very briefly make 3 points on this panel's topic, the future of the NPT. My first point, the most important challenge for the future of the NPT is to rebuild habits of cooperation among all NPT parties. And to start to doing so is to recognize what is at stake. Unless we can succeed in rebuilding habits of cooperation, the outcome at the 2020 NPT Review Conference will be the first back-to-back review conference breakdowns in the NPT's history. A breakdown coming 50 years after entry into force, 25 years after indefinite extension. Now, some persons would say, who cares? I say all NPT parties should care because back-to-back breakdowns at that unique point in the NPT's history will weaken the treaty with uncertain political and psychological ripple effects. Rebuilding habits of cooperation also is vital because there are multiple pathways that could lead to the erosion of the NPT's legitimacy, effectiveness, and support in the years ahead. Yes, some of these pathways are more credible than others. Yes, we have heard warnings before of the NPT in crisis, but taken together, these pathways are a reason for concern. Moreover, let's not forget the security interests of all of today's protagonists would be damaged by erosion of the NPT. My second point, rebuilding habits of cooperation requires recognizing the realities of the Prohibition Treaty, and in light of those realities, crafting a workable approach to the Prohibition Treaty at the Review Conference. Meaning what? For nuclear weapon state and non-nuclear weapon state opponents of the Prohibition Treaty, recognize the reality that a good number of countries judge that the Prohibition Treaty is an important step forward, and be prepared to acknowledge that judgment in any 2020 outcome, even while also acknowledging at the same time that this judgment is far from shared by all NPT parties. For Prohibition Treaty supporters, don't seek to make the 2020 Review Conference into a referendum of endorsement of the Prohibition Treaty, a referendum that almost certainly will prove both unavailing and counterproductive. For all NPT parties, use the Review Conference to help address the realities that led directly to the Prohibition Treaty, legitimate concerns about the nuclear disarmament stalemate, and about the risk of use of nuclear weapons. How so? First, the Review Conference should reaffirm the importance of preserving and then revitalizing the U.S.-Russia arms control process, and at the same time, the importance of putting in place a process of cooperative strategic reassurance between the United States and China. I will return to this point later. Second, the review conference should have a full discussion of the many proposed actions to reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons. To what end? One outcome would be for all NPT parties, not least the NPT's nuclear weapon states, to reaffirm their recognition, as it was once put, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. In addition, the 2020 Review Conference should ask the nuclear weapon states to report back to all NPT parties at the first preparatory committee meeting for 2025 in 2022, should report back to all NPT parties on what actions the nuclear weapon states believe can and should be taken to reduce to an absolute minimum the risk of use of nuclear weapons. Don't try again to get the nuclear weapon states to agree to one or another preferred non-nuclear weapon state risk reduction idea. Put the burden on the nuclear weapon states to tell the NPT community what they will commit to do to reduce nuclear risks. Third, the NPT parties, if we take these realities of the Prohibition Treaty seriously, should engage in a full exchange on the conditions for resumed and sustained nuclear disarmament progress. And in light of that exchange, identify and commit to specific areas for cooperation to advance those conditions between 2020 and 25. Fourth, the review conference should debate different visions of a desirable and achievable interim nuclear future for 2045, 100 years after the first and only use of nuclear weapons. Why? Because unless the parties can find a unifying vision to which they can rally in practice and not simply in rhetoric, we've been really good at rallying in rhetoric, today's dangerous polarization will worsen and it will ultimately call into question the NPT's future. As some of you know, my own preferred vision is the strategic elimination of nuclear weapons by 2045. Not their complete physical elimination, but their elimination as means of security and statecraft. Now, briefly, my third point. I want to return to the challenge of avoiding accelerating global nuclear arms competition. For the United States and Russia, the two countries' leaderships need to find a way to step back to ask themselves, independently and jointly, whether the breakdown of over 50 years of sometimes more, sometimes less, cooperative management of the U.S.-Russia strategic relationship and its replacement by unfettered strategic unilateralism will serve U.S. and Russian security interests. Replacing cooperative management by strategic unilateralism. I think there are good reasons to believe that the answer to this question is no. A breakdown will increase nuclear dangers. A breakdown will be economically costly. A breakdown will make it harder to cooperate on other issues, and a breakdown will heighten the risk of an erosion of the NPT. For all of these reasons, Putin's Kremlin and Trump's Washington should find a way to ask whether they really want the strategic train wreck both countries are rapidly approaching. At best, this joint assessment would be official, but I think that's hard to see for a variety of reasons. An alternative approach would be for the two presidents to create a graybeard panel of retired, very top-level civilian officials and military leaders. And under graybeards, I include women as well as men, because my image of the graybeards includes former national security advisors, former secretaries of state, and former secretaries of defense. And at least in the United States, there's a whole bunch of high-level women involved. The two presidents should create this type of a senior review panel to ask this question: do we want the strategic train wreck we're about to have? And report back. The answer, I think, is likely to be no, we don't want the strategic train wreck, And here's how we might get out of it. But Beijing and Washington also are approaching a strategic turning point. China is the country never discussed in these. Here, avoiding accelerating global nuclear arms competition requires that the leaderships in Beijing and Washington ask the same question. Do they want this type of growing strategic competition, or would their interests be better served by a process of mutual reassurance and restraint? Again, the two leaderships could ask this question officially, or you could have some sort of semi-official process which links into a decade-long official dialogue that's occurred. Let me stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dell, Ambassador Higgie.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, colleagues. Now, Daryl has been quite insistent that this panel should be forward-looking this morning, and Lou has certainly complied with his instructions fully. I want to disobey them, and just briefly though, just very briefly, and on the basis that we do ignore history at our peril, I want to take a short view backwards into the rear vision mirror and revisit the contract, the deal, which lies at the heart of the NPT. Now, of course, to my mind, it seems rather fitting to do this at a meeting here in Washington, given that it is the United States that has been leading the way in recent times in stressing the need for implementation of a deal to be fair on all the parties and not just to meet the contractual terms favored by some of them. So because we've had this treaty for so long now, 50 years, it's easy to overlook just how rare, how very unusual a deal it is. I cannot think of any other multilateral treaty in the security or disarmament domain in which the obligations on states' parties are differentiated by, for instance, a prohibition on one not being a prohibition on all. Other treaties in this field do reflect the fundamental premise of international law regarding the equality of states by creating obligations which are uniform and fully reciprocal for all states signing onto them. Such examples that come readily to mind include the Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention, inhumane weapons under the CCW framework, landmines, cluster munitions, and so on. Now, in highlighting the NPT's departure from this norm, I am not meaning to suggest that the treaty's approach, its grand bargain, is somehow flawed or defective. Absolutely not. I think it was a highly constructive and creative innovation, one which met the needs of the time and which has been fundamental to the treaty's success in building support for non-proliferation over many years. But I am wanting to make the point that it represents a very rare instance when the basic premise, as a matter of international law, of the sovereign equality of states has not predominated the terms of a treaty. It was a little surprise then that support for the NPT text at the time of its creation was not universal, and it certainly did not attract consensus in the vote held on it in June 1968, either in the UN General Assembly or in the Security Council. But for many of the 95 states that did vote in favor in the General Assembly, in favor of the treaty, a key drawcard, we might even call it something of an equalizer for non-nuclear weapon states, was the treaty's disarmament undertaking, its Article 6. It had, of course, been a number of non-nuclear weapon states who had insisted on Article 6's inclusion in the text in the first place. And undoubtedly for them, it was a sine qua non for their subsequent ratification of it. I hope that this snapshot of history serves to underline the significance of Article 6 in the very innovative deal struck in the NPT. Equally, the text of the treaty makes it clear that Article 6 cannot be treated as if it were peripheral or subsidiary to other aspects of the treaty. There is no conditionality in the language of Article 6, however much some might now wish there were. The very real fact that all parties to the treaty can properly be said to derive benefit from it, in view of the success it has had in constraining horizontal proliferation and keeping the number of nuclear weapon possessors as low as it currently is, that benefit in no way displaces the obligation to deliver fairly on the core obligations of the deal. It's probably been clear to everyone here for quite a while that a considerable number of the treaty's membership think that Article 6 is not, in fact, being implemented fairly. Last year's treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is one symptom of recent dissatisfaction. A checklist of implementation of the disarmament-related steps in the 2010 action plan, or indeed of the disarmament elements in the 2000 or 1995 review conference outcomes, would reveal much of the source of that dissatisfaction. So from the perspective of a non-nuclear weapon state like New Zealand, the most important systemic challenge I see confronting states parties to the NPT is how to sustain the treaty's credibility and persuade its members, most notably with respect to Article 6, given that this is where implementation is crucially lagging, how to persuade them that they can indeed expect the NPT deal to be delivered upon fairly in keeping with the treaty's object and purpose. So, what sort of initiatives are able to help meet this challenge? May I start with a negative definition? I think that efforts to repackage the Article 6 bargain, for instance, by seeking to add into its language new conditionalities not present in the text, do not improve and probably exacerbate the situation. Equally, recommendations relating to bridge building, whilst undoubtedly well-meaning, seem mesmerized with process at the expense of substance, and they seem bound to leave you in the middle of a river rather than living up to their name and getting you to any destination at all on the other side. Now, on to a more positive note. We do already have an expansive listing of possibilities from the 2000 and 2010 Consensual Review Conference outcome. They list actions relating to reductions in numbers, transparency, reporting, reducing the role of nuclear weapons in strategic doctrine and military planning, lowering the operational status of nuclear weapons, and so on. And there is also very clearly important unfinished business on the Middle East WMD free zone. Surely there is fertile ground within these consensual documents for initiatives from the nuclear weapon states. That said, it is hard to disagree with the comment in Lou's excellent paper, which I have thoroughly read and absorbed, Lou, on a practical agenda to reduce nuclear dangers, and you made many of these similar points this morning. And in your paper, I know you said at the outset that realistically, dramatic advances are not to be expected right now. We may not be able to hope for the sort of dramatic developments that can sometimes happen, even in unpropitious times, but I would hope that with the 2020 Review Conference soon upon us, policy leaders and the nuclear weapon states will pick up the pace and work seriously through the outcomes of 2000 and 2010, at identifying where either individually or collectively they can move forward and make progress on implementation of Article 6. I'm abiding by your recommendation, Lou, that non-nuclear weapon states effectively shouldn't be trying to pick and choose and direct nuclear weapon states. They should decide for themselves, of course, provided they do move forward. So I'm not going to identify where I see the realistic opportunities for initiatives and forward moving. I'm going to leave that to the nuclear weapon states. Thank you.
Great. Before I give a really great colleague, Andrea, the floor, I'll note that she spent many, many, many hours last week dealing with Syrian chemical weapons attacks. So we've promised to be kind. She's promised not to fall asleep during her presentation. And take it away.
Great. So thanks to Tom, thanks to the Arms Control Association for having me here. This is an important discussion at an important time. And I am, of course, extremely privileged to be here with two great colleagues on the panel and one fantastic moderator who I've worked with for a long time. We've had a series of busy weeks in the nonproliferation world, and I will note that it shows all the greater relevance to the nonproliferation community today. And I will tell you, sitting in the Situation Room at one point last week, waiting to get up on a civets with foreign partners, one of my colleagues noted, anyone looking at our foreign policy would be confused. We appear to be all over the place. So 3 weeks ago, all we could deal with was Russia and expelling Russians from the United States in retaliation for their actions. And last week, all we were worried about is North Korea. And then this week, you know, it's Syria. So it looks like we're all over the place. And I said, we're not all over the place. It's about WMD. It's about proliferation. And so I think we have a series of challenges across the board that we need to grapple with. This is an important one to discuss today. But this community remains extremely relevant, and I think non-proliferation is under threat. And so I'm glad to be here to have this discussion. I would say that the White House has recently completed a series of treaty reviews. You know, like all administrations, we've gone back through where the last administration was, tried to think through what might be different here. There were a series of documents and reviews that needed to be completed before we got here. Obviously, the nuclear posture review, the national security strategy, and once those were built, we could complete the treaty reviews that we'd already started. I will also apologize in advance because some of those plan to be rolled out next week at the NPT PrepCom and then in subsequent meetings there. So there will be some things I'm going to keep a little bit close for now, but you will very soon see a little bit more of our thinking in the coming weeks. So with that, I'd like to offer a few comments on the administration's approach to the NPT, including the key objectives that we are looking to advance at next week's PrepCom meeting taking place in Geneva. So it's certainly an honor to be asked to provide remarks on the NPT in this 50th year since the NPT was open for signature. Now as then, the NPT remains the cornerstone of the nuclear nonproliferation regime, providing the international legal framework to constrain and deny those who seek to engage in the proliferation of nuclear weapons. However, the NPT and the broader nuclear nonproliferation regime, as the other proliferation regimes, face acute challenges today. So as the President states in his letter introducing the national security strategy, the world is filled with a wide range of threats that have intensified in recent years. The danger from hostile state and non-state actors who are trying to acquire nuclear, chemical, radiological, and biological weapons is increasing despite our best efforts. North Korea's illicit nuclear and ballistic missile programs are a grave threat to global security and pose severe challenges to the non-proliferation regime we hold dear. These programs are also in direct opposition to multiple UN Security Council resolutions. And if we are not effective in our efforts to return North Korea to the non-proliferation regime, additional regional and global threats may emerge. Iran retains the ability to produce weapons-grade uranium for use in nuclear weapons should it decide to do so. Combined with Iran's ongoing missile program, this situation remains a serious concern for the United States and for the international community. And as Tom noted, I've spent a lot of time recently focused on the Syrian regime and its unfortunate and historic thwarting of non-proliferation regimes across the board. For this discussion, I'd note that Syria was found in non-compliance with its IAEA obligations in 2011. In the 7 years since, the Syrian regime has made no effort to engage the IAEA to remedy its non-compliance or address international concerns, despite the clear evidence in front of us. We should be using our collective leverage to bring these clear violators back into compliance. While they thumb their noses at the non-proliferation architecture we have built, threatening regional security, how can we say that the conditions are ripe for disarmament? We've asked for the help of those across the globe to hold North Korea, Iran, and Syria accountable for their threats to the non-proliferation regime. If states care as much as we do about the viability of the non-proliferation regime, why will they not stand with us in its defense? These are the real-world security issues that demand from all states parties a real-world response. How can NPT states parties find additional ways to work together to overcome these challenges, and why has it been so hard? That, I think, is the heart of our work over the next 2 years in the build-up to the 2020 NPT Review Conference. If we can work together on the here and now, we can shape the future in the important ways we need to make all the elements of the NPT a reality. We have much in common, and we should build on those principles. For our part, the United States remains strongly committed to nuclear nonproliferation. We continue to abide by our obligations under the NPT, and we continue active work to strengthen the NPT regime. The International Atomic Energy Agency and the International Safeguards System are critical partners in this effort, ensuring that there's durable progress on nonproliferation and offering a path to further negotiations on nuclear disarmament. The straightforward answer to the how do we work together question, to us, is to find and focus on common interests. We continue to welcome partnership with NPT states parties to reestablish the central role of nonproliferation in the NPT. An effective nonproliferation regime is key to establishing the conditions for further progress on disarmament and for expanding access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy that so many states hold dear. We continue to welcome partnership with NPT states parties to focus on those real-world security issues I already noted. We were encouraged to see near universal condemnation of North Korea's nuclear testing and ballistic missile development at the 2017 NPT PrepCom. We will urge all countries to continue the global maximum pressure campaign against North Korea, including the full implementation of UN Security Council resolutions until North Korea denuclearizes. If we abandon pressure too early, we risk undermining what is truly a historic opportunity. We continue to welcome partnership on disarmament, but it must be addressed as a real-world policy problem. International security conditions at the moment are not conducive for further reductions. We all need to think hard about measures that would be most effective in creating those conditions that would be more fitting for nuclear disarmament. We continue to welcome partnership in promoting the additional protocol as the de facto standard for verifying states are meeting their NPT safeguards obligations. And we continue to welcome partnership in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy under sound nonproliferation conditions. Look for the United States to discuss each of these priorities in further detail at next week's PrepCom, and I'm pleased that our delegation will be led by Assistant Secretary Chris Ford, with whom not too long ago I worked extremely closely. I'll also make just one mention of what won't work, and that's unrealistic agendas pursued by those focused almost exclusively on single issues such as nuclear disarmament or specific regional concerns. We all have a shared interest in strengthening the treaty, and we need to discuss the treaty in all of its aspects. Finally, I was asked to comment on how we can avoid an acceleration of global nuclear arms competition. The United States remains concerned by the growth of nuclear stockpiles and capabilities by NPT and non-NPT states parties alike. And we continue to encourage all states with nuclear weapons to exercise restraint regarding nuclear and missile capabilities. We will continue to work to minimize the number of nuclear armed states, including by maintaining credible U.S. extended deterrence and assurance. And we will deny terrorist organizations access to nuclear weapons, materials, and expertise, and strictly control weapons usable material, related technology, and expertise. Despite the difficult security environment, the United States, for its part, remains open to engaging in arms control and disarmament talks, including with Russia and China, that advance U.S., allied, and partner security and are verifiable and enforceable. And as many of you may know, Russia postponed the second round of strategic stability talks, which we had hoped to have in March. As the world's two largest nuclear powers, we have a special responsibility to maintain a stable strategic relationship and reduce nuclear risks. We continue to seek to reestablish the conditions necessary for greater trust with Russia and improve transparency with China as it expands and modernizes its own nuclear forces. One idea for a practical step: I would note that not all nuclear possessors have established a moratorium on the production of fissile material. I'd like to encourage all states that have not yet done so to declare and maintain moratoria on the production of fissile material for use in nuclear weapons, which is a key step in nonproliferation. And of course, I'd be remiss not to come back to North Korea. We welcome the recent developments indicating North Korea's willingness to engage in talks on denuclearization. Our ongoing pressure campaign is clearly having an impact, and we like to remain hopeful that we'll be able to make progress in the upcoming summit. We have a tremendous opportunity upcoming. We're cautiously, as I said, optimistic that North Korea does understand that there's a different path available. As the president has said, there's a brighter path for North Korea if it chooses denuclearization. So I'd leave it there for now. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you. So if the audience will allow me, I'll do one quick question to each of the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor. Since the Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone has been mentioned a couple of times, and since I spent 5 years, 5 years of my life on that effort, I would just make a very quick comment, which is that the co-conveners never succeeded in convincing the parties, the states of the Middle East, to take ownership of the process. It was one delegated to the co-conveners, and there has not been then or now an interest in states taking initiatives anywhere other than at NPT conferences to do something about it, to move the process forward. I confidently predict, and this leads to my question to you, Dell, that if there's not a change in the procedures, including the habits of cooperation, at the 2020 Review Conference, you will have exactly the same result at the 2015 conference, a breakdown over a single issue that is deliberately held until the final 24 hours of the conference. So Lou, what are the actual prospects for accomplishing what you mentioned, which is a different mode of working, a different habit of cooperation between now and 2020?
I think, Tom, the prospects for reaching a different mode of working on the nuclear disarmament issues, on the risk reduction issues, on the non-proliferation issues, in which the parties try to work together and try to identify where they have common interests and where they can make progress. I think those prospects, I'm an optimist. I think that those prospects are relatively good. I think those prospects are relatively good because I think ultimately the group of parties who are in the NPT will come to the conclusion, the way I like to put it, it's not like the movie Casablanca, in which Rick says to Ilsa at the end of the meeting, well, we lost Paris, but we now have Paris and we'll always have Paris. It's not like we always have the NPT. The NPT is something that actually could begin to erode, which will not serve the interests of any of the parties. And I think there's a possibility that you will have this recognition amongst all the parties that, look, we need to work together. And I think there are enough places where they do have common interests. The one area where I do believe there's a common interest amongst the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states is to reduce the risk that these weapons might ever be used again. And to come to some sort of a reaffirmation of the fact that you cannot win a nuclear war and it should never be fought. to try to come to some affirmation of, let's come back to us with some specific measures which could reduce this risk. It's in the interest of the nuclear weapon states, because if nuclear weapons are ever used again, it's quite likely that the nuclear weapon states are going to be the first victims of it, setting aside India and Pakistan. But there are other scenarios which deal with the Russians in the United States, the Chinese in the United States, whatever. And I think that applies. So I'm on the Middle East issue, though. I just can't see a way forward. And the question is whether you can find a different way, or the question is whether the group of Arab countries that have pressed this issue so hard decide that they have other interests in the NPT which are more important than bringing the house down over the Middle East issue. So I remain optimistic that the parties will want to work together.
Okay, thank you. Dell, Lou suggested that while the RevCon has to recognize the reality of the new prohibition treaty, it can't become obsessed with debating the prohibition treaty in the review conference. Do you think that's correct, and do you think that's feasible? And as part of that, is it possible to restrain the most vigorous advocates of the prohibition treaty from injecting this into every part of the discussion?
I definitely think so, Tom. When Lou said that it will be important that the non-nuclear weapon states, the supporters of the Prohibition Treaty, don't turn the 2020 conference into a referendum on the Prohibition Treaty, I sat back thinking, well, I'm not really nervous and fearful of that at all. I don't think it will happen. I am rather alarmed that there is a prospect that it is some of the nuclear weapon states, or all maybe of the nuclear weapon states, who will themselves be so preoccupied with the Prohibition Treaty that they actually are overly focused on it. There's been some suggestion, you know, that maybe the nuclear weapon states are still in punishment mode. And if that's the dominant emotion that nuclear weapon states have toward the treaty, and they see the NPT Review Conference process as an opportunity to make clear how angry or vengeful they might be about the Prohibition Treaty. In fact, maybe the greater risk is in their attitude. I think that non-nuclear weapon states, Prohibition Treaty supporters, because we all support the NPT, I think that we will have a very balanced approach, and I don't think that we are going to turn the NPT Review Conference into a discussion opportunity for the Prohibition Treaty.
Well, thank you. Andrea, under the pressure of these bright lights, I withdraw my promise to be kind. I'd like to talk for a moment not so much about interests, but a little bit about language, about rhetoric. And building on what Dell just said about the focus of some of the nuclear weapon states on the Prohibition Treaty, what I've observed, and perhaps I haven't observed closely enough, is that over the last year, it is harder and harder to distinguish between Russian and American rhetoric at international gatherings in critiquing the advocates of the Prohibition Treaty as naive or counterproductive. That concerns me, and I'm wondering if it will change. In addition, I think as we look forward to 2020, some who may be familiar with the 2005 RevCon are concerned about the influence of John Bolton, now the National Security Advisor. And I think many of us are also concerned about the fact that the current U.S. statement, as you've given it again, is about the importance of doing non-proliferation and peaceful uses cooperation now and doing disarmament later, that there is no active U.S. proposal to move forward on disarmament in the coming time. Should we expect that rhetoric to continue? Is there a concern about how that affects U.S. influence with other NPT parties?
So not only did you renege on our bargain, but you actually asked 3 questions.
Yes.
At least 3 questions. So let's see if I get them all in sequence here. On the question of whether the nuclear weapon states are going to be overly focused on the ban treaty and the difficulty in distinguishing between U.S. and Russian views, I would say, first of all, you've all been asking for us to find issues of common interest with Russia, and I think we found one. But instead of making light of that, I think it shows how strongly the nuclear weapon states feel that the ban treaty is not helpful, period, and could distract from the NPT itself and then the meetings surrounding the NPT. I will say that our goal for the PrepCom is not to focus on the ban treaty. We would love it if the ban treaty didn't come up, frankly, because we think it's a distraction from the issues we have to grapple with. And so I think you will continue to get responses and rhetoric at points from across the nuclear weapon states in response to what they perceive as rhetoric and challenges from those who are challenging back at them. And I do think that you'll continue to see similar views from Russia and the United States on this, although I would hope that the way we deliver those views might be slightly different. But I think we do have a lot of commonality on this topic, and not just with Russia, but with the other P5 states. In terms of the 2005 RevCon and our new national security advisor, I will tell you that he is taking on information faster than any human being I have ever seen, straight up. And he is walking back through the issues and very clearly walking through where he last left them, last time he was in government, and walking back through where we are now and carefully considering where we need to go from here. And that is a very considered conversation. He's a extremely smart individual with the president's confidence who knows these issues very well. So I think it's too early to tell what his updated views will be, but I know that he's going through them in an extremely careful and considered manner. He has a lot on his plate. Remember that day one, our first meeting was on Syria, CW, and that was a very long week for the National Security Advisor, among others. And as he enters the White House, we have a lot of high-pressure, short-fuse issues on his plate, and I know that he will turn to this one. He will think about this one, and we will soon have a really engaged conversation about how all these issues work together. I will tell you that he, like those before him, believe that arms control, when in the U.S. interests, remains an important pillar of strategic stability. The question is, given where we are on multiple arms control treaties and Russia's violations, how do we get back to that process? And Russia's unwillingness to actually meet and have those strategic stability talks is definitely making it harder, but that's not for a lack of interest on the U.S. side of getting there. In terms of a current statement and rhetoric on peaceful uses now and disarmament later, I think I would make 2 points. The first is these are both important parts of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if we don't focus on nuclear material security, on trying to reduce the increasing stockpiles of fissile material in certain countries, reduce the pursuit of destabilizing weapons in those countries, getting to disarmament will be far more difficult, not just for us, but what kind of world do we live in if the P5 disarm and we're left with nuclear arsenals in countries where there are overlaps with terrorism? To me, that's a world far, far more frightening than the one we live in today, and one I'm really committed to working hard to protect against. But I don't see, it's not an if then, it's, we remain committed to the long-term principle of disarmament, But we have to get to a place where that's a more stable world than it would be today, with an armed North Korea, with terrorists having potential, the potential for acquiring the capabilities they would need. We need to keep these weapons out of the hands of those who would use them, and that means we have to be pursuing the Non-Proliferation Treaty and all of its aspects at the same time, because all of those principles are important.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea. I do appreciate sincerely your assurances. Thank you. We have about 25 minutes for questions from the audience. And so we have Liz and Ryan and Sidra who have microphones. Why don't we start in the center here with Michael, and then we'll go to the back and then come to the front with John. Yeah, Ryan, if you, right behind you.
Thank you. Is this working? Good.
Yeah.
Thank you all for a very useful presentation. I came down from teaching today. I canceled my class because I want to come back and bring this material to my students. And I think one of the class on American foreign policy. And one question I have is on Iran. And Ms. Hall, you mentioned it briefly, and I know there are things you can say, but could you tell me what I could bring back? We're studying the Iranian situation. What do you think is the likelihood of some kind of positive outcome, or is there none? Or what are the options that you foresee with respect to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
Okay, let's gather 3 questions and give the 3 of you a chance to gather your thoughts and pick one in the back right there. And then Liz, if you give this to John right there.
I'm Yong Sup-han from Korea, South Korean arms controller. And I have problem nowadays in the United States and in the world welcoming the younger North Korean prodigal son who are coming from nuclear to denuclearize. And as a older South Korean son who was faithful to denuclearization. And if you say denuclearization of North Korea, we failed 3 times in denuclearization agreements of Korean Peninsula and Geneva Agreed Framework, and also 6-5 talks, denuclearize. If you look at North Korean interpretation of denuclearization in the previous 3 agreements, they all say, shut down and freezing and sealing and disabling into shutdown in North Korean newspapers. So don't use denuclearization again. Please use verifiable dismantlement of nuclear weapons of North Korea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, and then we'll go to questions. And if you can pass the microphones to 3 more people here. Go ahead, John.
John Wolfstall at the Nuclear Crisis Group. I'm thrilled to take the mic because I once quit a job with Lou to take a job at the Arms Control Association after an annual meeting at the ACA. So
welcome back.
I hope my current boss isn't here. I'll get nervous. Andrea, I want to give you a chance to dust off and practice the talking points on a couple issues. The one is, if you can, today, whether the Treaty Review has established a position on New START and whether we will seek extension. If you can't reveal it today, can you at least tell us whether that will be something that will be rolled out at the NPT one way or another, because there's great interest in that, particularly given the concern about, that Lou described, the prospect of an unbridled unilateral competition. And the second is, maybe to put a finer point on the first question, I think one of the challenges will be for the United States a desire to ensure that everybody is implementing their obligations broadly defined in the NPT. How do you propose to square that rhetorically with the president's statement that he's prepared to leave the JCPOA, even though all of the parties are abiding by their obligations? There has to be some coherent explanation for that. I want to give you a chance to try to roll that out and field test it.
So Andrea, we'll turn to you first to cover in 45 seconds 3 simple topics. JCPOA, North Korea, New START, and then I'll ask Lou and Dunn if they want to, Lou and Dell if they want to add comments. Andrea?
Yeah, so, I don't have any new announcement on JCPOA. The president has committed to work closely with the European allies. We've been engaged in working closely with the European allies to try to fix what he and the administration believe are serious flaws in the agreement as it stands. And the president's committed to not ending up in a decade with the same nuclear threat that we were worried about that led the last administration to the agreement. So for now, we're continuing to work with the E3 very closely. We're continuing to think about how do we get the assurances we need on Iranian ballistic missiles and Iran's nuclear program longer term. And the president's made very clear that if we can't get to that deal, he's willing to withdraw from the JCPOA and put additional pressure on them to make sure that we've denied Iran all paths to a nuclear weapon and that they don't build a ballistic missile program that threatens the United States and our allies. So that's where we are. We have a countdown clock. We know how many days we have left till we get to May 12th, and we're working really aggressively to make sure that all parties understand that we're serious about making sure that Iran does not pose a threat to the United States now or in the future. So that's where we are on JCPOA. On North Korean denuclearization, I've heard that point before, in fact, from folks from the Republic of Korea as well. We will certainly take that under advisement. I will say when you compare the approach now to the approaches in the past negotiation cycles, that the president has made it very clear that we won't fall prey to what happened in the past while we gave North Korea carrots to get to those really important steps under verifiable disarmament. The president has made 100% clear, and the call to the allies and partners is that we have to keep the pressure on North Korea so it cannot take the opportunity of these talks to take advantage of reduced pressure, right? And so that's the president's very clear mandate to us, is to make sure that we're working in the right direction with partners and allies. And we have a strong, as you know, very strong work with the partners and allies in the region and beyond to make sure that we can keep that pressure on to support the president's objectives of reducing the threat from North Korea. On New START extension, right now we have not gotten to a new position on New START extension. We, of course, remain committed to the treaty. We met the central limits and feel very strongly that we met the central limits in February and are willing to continue to talk with Russia about the future of that treaty. But I don't have anything, and they won't next week, have anything more to announce on that, because I think we're still waiting to continue engagement with Russia on that. And then my great opportunity for rolling out new policy on camera, which is much appreciated, John. Yeah. I mean, we hear that criticism a lot, which is, how does what happens in one treaty space matter for another treaty space? And I certainly, I understand that criticism and that question. I think what we have are fundamentally different kinds of treaties. And I think it's, the disarmament question and debates over the U.S. position there aside, I think the United States has remained firmly committed, administration after administration, to non-proliferation, right? I think we are leading in this. I think we are pushing for the signing of the additional protocol, which the ban treaty doesn't do. We are pushing to ensure that technologies that might lead to proliferation are stemmed and not pursued. I know we get criticism for these things, but a huge part of my job is focused on those very aspects. It's about materials control, nuclear security, all of those things that are critical, building alliances across the globe to make sure that terrorists can't get nuclear weapons, that states don't lose nuclear weapons, that states aren't pursuing the nuclear weapons that are destabilizing. And so I would say, while we clearly have some things to work through at the NPT PrepCom, because we do have different opinions with other states party to the treaty, I think our commitment to the elements of that treaty really is unquestioned. It's maybe a question of timing, but I don't think it's a question of commitment. And I think the longevity of that commitment and demonstration and our current activities supporting it put us in a very different place with the NPT than the JCPOA, which is a recent deal with limited prohibitions on activities that as soon as they can open back up present a new threat to the United States. And so I think they're apples and oranges. And so I would caution, folks to take each of those treaties and each of those considerations on their merits. And we're happy to continue to discuss them and why we think they're different. But that would be my answer there, John.
Dell or Lou, any comment on these questions or the answers?
I had a comment on Dell's point earlier, if I may.
Go ahead, please.
I think, Dell, that your point that the nuclear weapon states may be the ones that turn 2020 into a debate over the Prohibition Treaty is an important point. And I think that that has to be acknowledged as a potential risk. And I think that the inclination to do so probably varies across the NPT nuclear weapon states. And I think it brings us back to the most fundamental questions that I think that particularly the United States and Russia, but not only the United States and Russia, but the United States, Russia, and France need to ask, which is whether it is in their interests in terms of however they define those interests, in terms of non-proliferation, peaceful uses, whatever, whether it's in their interest to have another breakdown in 2020. The institutional memory is likely to go down the path of it does not matter if there's another breakdown. All that matters is we go to the review conference and we have a full discussion. It doesn't matter if there's no agreement. I wrote those talking points in 1983, and my bet is they're still in the file cabinet somewhere. But I think,
right here, Lou.
you may. But I think that the officials in these three countries need to ask themselves whether 2020 is going to be fundamentally different than a whole bunch of all these other review conferences where it didn't really matter in a fundamental way. I think, and that's the question that has to be debated internally. And I think 2020 will be different, not only because it's 75 years after the use of nuclear weapons, 50 years after the treaty entered into force, 25 years after its an indefinite extension, and it's after the Prohibition Treaty. There's a lot of reasons which suggest that these three countries in particular have a much bigger stake in being prepared to bend more and trying to avoid a situation in which everybody gets into a big debate about the Prohibition Treaty. And I think there is a way in which we can all agree to disagree on the Prohibition Treaty. We give it its place in history, but we don't make it, a central piece. But I just wanted to comment. I think you're right.
Thank you. Dell, any?
Here.
Okay. We're going to do three more questions. One in the back, right there. I know there's one behind you who has a mic. No, you're good.
Very good. Okay.
Then one here, and then right in the center, you're third.
Yeah, Jim Slattery. I have a follow-up question from Ms. Hall in JCPOA. I'm just curious, can you help us understand the thinking of those around the NSC who are advocating for walking away from the JCPOA on 2 points? One, do they believe doing so will encourage the North Koreans to sign some kind of an agreement to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula the day after we walk away from the JCPOA? And the second part of this question is, do these people honestly believe that the day after we walk away from the JCPOA, U.S. and Israeli national security interests are improved? Are we safer the day after we do this or not? Especially in light of people like Ehud Barak, who are now clearly saying that as long as Iran is complying with the JCPOA, Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. So I'm just, if you can provide any insight on that.
Right here near the front, please.
Veronica Cartier, I'm in a think tank for nuclear policy. It is the realization of arms race that we're talking about, and I would like to press that the confidence for NPT successful, it's about equal with the NPT crisis. And I would like to bring one issue as based on the United Nations Disarmament Commission has pledged practical implementation of transparency and confidence, building measures in outer space activities. So I think outer space activities also have to be included in NPT discussion because it influences for the arms race and modernization technology.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
Sang-min Lee from the Radio Free Asia. So I have a question.
I'm sorry, who's talking?
Me,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then,
yeah, I'm Sang-min Lee from the Radio Free Asia. I have a question for Ms. Hall. I think you must be busy preparing the summit between North Korea and the US coming maybe June. I have a question about the possibility of the withdrawal US troops in South Korea as a negotiation card when the summit is held. So what do you think, what is your position about the possibility to withdraw the US troops in South Korea as a negotiation deal when you meet the North Korean?
yeah, could you repeat the last sentence, the question?
The question is about the position about the possibility of withdraw U.S. troops in South Korea as a negotiation deal when President Trump meet the President Kim Jong-un.
Okay, and we're going to do a fourth question as you formulate your replies.
I'm Kathy Crandall Robinson with Tri-Valley Cares, which is a watchdog group that works around Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And I want to ask a question about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and how it relates to the NPT. The treaty is languishing. Is there any hope of progress towards entry into force, and is that important for the NPT in 2020? And the reverse case, if we see backward steps and a resumption of nuclear testing, more broadly a breakout, how dangerous is that for the NPT?
Okay, so let's do some answers. One of these questions was very specific, and that was the connection of outer space to the NPT. And I wonder, while Andrea, as usual, got a lot of these questions, Dell, do you have a view on this or an answer to a very specific technical question? Yeah.
Well, outer space issues have been contentious for quite some time now, and I'm sure many of you have tracked the discussions and the resolutions on it in the first committee each year. It's also on the agenda for the Conference on Disarmament, even although, as we all know, the CD gets nowhere on anything. I don't see that outer space has been a core element of the discussion in prep comms or in review conferences. And I guess, to be brutally honest, I see the going as difficult and tough enough without bringing in that issue there. Maybe it's just I haven't noticed that it's been under discussion, but it's certainly not been something that I've focused on during the preparatory process. Is that enough on that, Tom?
I think so. It's a question I've never thought about before, so thank you for raising it. Andrea?
Okay, so I'll start there, which is that I too haven't thought about it very much in that context, and I don't do space policy at the White House, so I'm not going to freelance today, but I'll definitely take back your comment to my colleagues who do that, and it's worth some thought and discussion beyond, I think, what I can provide to you today. In terms of the first two JCPOA related questions, I think on the first I have to defer for now, because when I talk about I reported to the Homeland Security Advisor and the National Security Advisor, both of which have left in the last little bit. And so I'm not going to freelance on what his current positions are, my new boss's current positions are on the first, but I understand, certainly understand and take note of the issue. On the second, on U.S.-Israeli interests and whether they're better the day after, I can tell you that the president wouldn't have the position that he will withdraw from the deal on May 12th if we can't close the gaps in it for our security. If he was not convinced that our security would be better, that what drove him to this decision is his conviction that U.S. security under those circumstances is better outside the deal. And of course, we talk often with the Israelis about our positions. So I would say, yes, he does believe straight up that our national security interests are better served. On the DPRK summit, while I am responsible and contributing to one significant part of the pieces there, it's our North Korea folks who are still building with the administration the context of that summit. And so, again, I'm not going to stray off my particular lane in the road. in CTBT, I'll make some initial comments and would really welcome the views of both Lou and Dell on it. Our position right now is that all states should be having a unilateral moratorium against nuclear testing. I do think if we really felt it was vital to our national interests to test in a limited way, just assure the sustainability and security of our stockpile, if it was necessary for our nuclear deterrent, that is the situation under which we would consider testing. But our hope is that all sign up to a moratorium. We believe right now we can get to a stable, secure nuclear deterrent without testing. And so that's why we abide by the moratorium, and we would call on other states to do the same. I certainly think that if we see a lot of states, and especially states not currently nuclear weapon states testing, we certainly have an issue. But it's in nobody's interest for the security of our nuclear deterrent to be questioned. And that is, of course, why our nuclear posture review does include a modernization of the nuclear force to some degree, not increasing in numbers, but making sure that it's stable, it's credible, and it's able to protect U.S. interests and the interests of our allies, to which we provide an extended deterrent as well. Thoughts on the CTBT?
Lou, did you want to comment on CTBT or anything else, or Dell?
I'd like on the CTBT, but Lou...
No, go ahead, Dell.
Okay, so I agree completely with what I think is probably the underlying premise of the question, that moratoria are all very well and good, but they can be situationally based. And if you're really intent upon giving strength to the norm against nuclear testing, there is no substitute, I think, for the entry into force of the CTBT. Certainly New Zealand, which has supported this treaty for a long time now, we feel that it gives us an absolutely waterproof position from which to denounce North Korea's activities and testing. I think that it's a little bit harder maybe to denounce what any other country does in terms of testing if you don't yourself commit to the legal requirement not to do so. I hear what Andrea has just said, but we remain a strong advocate for the CTBT. I heard some comments before we started today about idealism, and so I'm going to take off my idealistic hat maybe and be realistic. I don't see the CTBT as entering into force. I should say for the foreseeable period ahead, but hey, what's going to change? I don't see it entering into force for a long, long time, because there's no suggestion that any of the 7 countries whose ratification we have to have before it can become operational. I don't see anything. I wish I heard differently from one of them, but that's not to say it's dead. I mean, the International Monetary System is up and running and working very effectively, and for all I can tell, people remain committed to funding it. But I don't think, I'm sad to say it, I don't see much prospect of the treaty's entry into force, although I think it is the best and only durable way for really ensuring the universal norm against nuclear testing.
Lou, any brief comment? Okay, we need to wrap it up. I'm going to throw one more question at you, Andrea, which you are not obligated to answer now, because we
have... Is this
have...
wearing your nasty hat, or have you got...
No. It is...
Thank you, Dell.
It is not a rhetorical...
That's right, that's right.
Not a rhetorical question, and we have this afternoon Anita Fried, so feel free to force her to answer the question.
Sounds like a great proposition.
But the question is, I like the phrase verifiable and enforceable arms control agreements. Which arms control agreements does the United States government consider to be enforceable upon the United States?
So I think you're right that Anita is well placed.
Good.
Well done.
To be the woman in the chair to answer that question, and I encourage you to ask her the question.
All right. I think her staff is going to prepare her. You want to do the logistics of next steps? Let's thank our panel.